I mean, David Harvey. Today is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. It's a pretty significant date. By your tepid applause, I'm guessing that you have a mixed reaction to the Communist Party of China. Today, Tricontinental, Institute for Social Research, which I direct, has released a report called Serve the People. Oh, sorry. Well, worse than you, really. Worse than you. I thought it was all okay. Let me repeat myself. Today's the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, and there we go. That's a much better. And I see you're not clapping.
I'm thinking about it.
You're thinking about it. Okay, that's Michael's problem there. Tricontinental, Tricontinental.org. You can download for free in many languages a report called "Serve the People," which was put together by our team in Shanghai, and it's a report on the abolition of extreme poverty in China. 800 million people lifted out of poverty. Now, I was born in India in 1967, a very fine year, 2 years before Ho Chi Minh died. And that's important because yesterday I just finished the introduction to my selected Ho Chi Minh. Friends, I've been working on that book since 1996. Don't make air quotes. It's done now. So it's an incredibly important study. I'd like you to look at it. We released it today as an homage to the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China has done amazing things to lift people out of poverty. Imagine, I grew up in India. India has as many people in extreme poverty today as China has lifted out of extreme poverty. Just imagine that. If you had a choice to be born in China or in India, where would you pick? Unless you were born in the Ambani or Adani family. If you were born in a slum in India or in a working class family in China, where would you choose? It's easy for people in the United States to have this or that criticism of China, but you don't understand what it means to be born in a country that had been colonized and lived with a wretched old culture. You just don't get it, guys. You live on the other side of imperialism. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. You know, I read this book with a great deal of enjoyment. One of the reasons I really enjoyed it is this has, in a very conversational way, all the major themes of David Harvey's work since the 1960s. It has his really gripping sense of what urbanism is to capitalism. It has his fascination, and he says it, a term he likes, spatial fix. It has the spatial fix explained, I think, as clearly as you'll get in any of his other texts. But more importantly, the chapter on accumulation by dispossession, which I didn't know was a term that came from Arrighi, is an incredibly useful summary of this vital concept of accumulation by dispossession. It has these in a very conversational way. This is an incredibly useful book. And David, thanks for doing it, honestly. Chris is the better judge than you of anything that you do, David. Anything that you do. Just listen to Chris. Not only does Chris put your mic on, thanks, Leanne. Thanks a lot. But it's a really good book for that, you know, because it puts together for you, I would say, some of the principal, things that have detained David over the course of these last decades. So I think it's really vital, it's important, and you know how important David's work is, so I'm not going to spend time in going over that. Instead, of course, I'm going to talk about what preoccupies me and what I didn't see in the book, David. So in that sense, it's really about me now, which, I'm sorry, guys, you came to hear about David, but this section is about me. There are three things I'd like to talk about, which I think are pretty important. One of them is, of course, David has been for a while in a debate, a public debate, with Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik and with John Smith on the question of imperialism. And it is striking, though, reading the book, how imperialism doesn't really come in except in the margins. It's not a structuring concept. And I would like David to talk a little bit, because I know David thinks about these things greatly. How do we really understand the fact that the United States spends more on its military force than any country on the planet, and then, more than the next, I think, 9 or 10 countries in the world? Why are there so many US bases? How are we to understand the hybrid war that the United States prosecutes against Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Syria, you name it, friends, including, of course, China? David has a very interesting perspective on why the United States is going after China, which I completely agree with. It's a question of technology, the question of capital-intensive production. 100% agree with the argument. But where is the concept of imperialism in this? I would like David to reflect on that for us. I'm not really that interested in the debate with the Patnaiks and with John Smith, because I think that's a different kind of question, David, that they have raised. It's at a different level. But how thinking about some of these issues of why it is that certain countries can't or shouldn't be allowed to move from labor-intensive production to capital-intensive production, what are extra economic pressures to be called other than imperialism? China is not asking the United States to stop doing capital-intensive production. So China, in that sense, is not being imperialist against the United States. There are no Chinese warships off the coast of New York City the last time I looked. There's plenty of US warships, and now one unfortunate bedraggled British warship. When did they begin to... The HMS of all things, Queen Elizabeth. For God's sake, she's still alive. The HMS Queen Elizabeth sailing off half the crew has COVID. It's a miserable, it's like the opium war on acid, I don't understand what the British are doing. They have a country that's falling apart, and yet they've decided they've got to go poke the Chinese, for what reason? So the first set of considerations, I think, is to raise the question, is it important to have the concept imperialism somehow appear in the text? And I wonder how it would appear, if not grounded in the material structure of this prevention of the shift from labor-intensive production to capital-intensive production. The second set of considerations, I'm very interested in the Leninist break. And by the way, I didn't plan to wear this T-shirt, okay? It's just that I grab a T-shirt off the shelf and put it on. Okay, I'm not like that. I would have worn a Ho Chi Minh T-shirt to celebrate the final completion of the book. But no, I wore this old Lenin shirt. The Leninist consideration to me is important. It's very interesting that in all the texts on Western Marxism, Lenin gets skipped. If you look at, say, Perry Anderson's considerable survey of Western Marxism, and he does it twice, by the way, he has 2 books on it. In both books, Lenin doesn't figure. He jumps from the second international thinkers over them to Gramsci or to Karl Koch or to let's say some of the more significant French figures. They skip Lenin, and I think that's significant. Ho Chi Minh doesn't skip Lenin. Lenin is in fact the beginning for them. Lenin is the beginning because what Lenin says is if you come from a colonized part of the world, the productive forces will not be developed for you there. Imperialism will not develop the productive forces. Therefore, you have to have a dual agenda, which Marx didn't think about. That's why Gramsci celebrated the Soviet Revolution as a revolt against capital. The book Capital, in fact. This is a revolt against the book. We need to take that seriously. We shouldn't duck that. What Lenin argued in the thesis to the Comintern 1920, which, Ho Chi Minh reads in L'Humanité and says, my God, the sun came out in the sky for me. I'd never read anything like this. What that Leninist breakthrough suggests is that we have to consider that you've got to push an anti-colonial national liberation strategy simultaneously with the socialist revolution, simultaneously with the social revolution, land reform and so on. You've got to move there. And we have to build the productive forces because, we can't wait for 1,000 years. And anyway, imperialism is never going to allow us to build the productive forces. So we've got to have this breakthrough. consideration of that Leninist moment, I think, helps us understand so much of what Marxism does outside North Atlantic states. And I think that's another area, I think, of consideration. If we neglect Lenin, I think we neglect that seam of Marxism that is developed outside the North Atlantic. You know, even Walden Bellow, in his introduction to the Verso edition of Ho Chi Minh, says he's not a theorist. I take great objection to that. This view that theorists are only, you know, in the academy in the West, whereas Ho Chi Minh or Mao are not theorists. Read them carefully, you will find a theory there. Isn't that what Gramsci said? Elaboration, elaborate theory out of practice. That's the obligation of the new intellectual. So the second set of considerations, I think, is where is Lenin in our thinking? Where is this Leninist moment, which actually is very important for 90% of the Marxists in the world, if not more. So that's the second set of considerations. The third set of considerations is what's the post-capitalist future? And, you know, I have to say, David, I read the first chapter and I stopped myself because I said, I'm reading this wrong. And in fact, I read right through and I was talking to Chris about it. But by the time I got to the last chapter, I realized that there is an issue here that I would like you to, you know, clarify. In the first chapter, David talks about how capitalism is too big to fail. And that's an interesting issue because this raises the question of socialism. You know, I think David is right in one sense that a post-capitalist situation today on a global scale, in other words, what used to be called in the communist international literature, the world revolution, is not going to happen in our time, perhaps, okay? We never know what happens, you know. I mean, imagine, do you think that the Russians sitting in Switzerland, like Lenin, thought there'd be a revolution in the largest country in the world? I don't think they thought that. Not at Zimmerwald. They certainly didn't think that at Zimmerwald. That was only 2.5 years before a revolution breaks out. So God knows what's going to happen, friends. We are living in a permanent COVID catastrophe. The way in which people are piss mad about the world as it is, we don't know what's going to happen. But I take the point that advanced capitalism is so sophisticated right now, it's so integrated, labor is so socialized, it's difficult to imagine properly the possibility of making socialism or even a socialist experiment in one country. Look at how the experiments are being sanctioned, the blockades and so on. These are firm and difficult. I take that point. On the other hand, I wonder very much if it's too big to fail, because in a way, capitalism is a failure for most people. It is actually existential failure already. So it's not a question of we will starve in the future. If we break down capitalism, we are already starving. You know, 2 to 3 billion people on the planet are already in starvation. So I'm thinking about this post-capitalist issue. I think we should think about it quite seriously. For me, the post-capitalist moment has to be understood now. We can't suspend it till later. Now, I take very seriously the line in the German ideology where Marx and Engels write that, look, guys, don't be idealists, okay? Communism isn't something that you impose outside into the world. Communism is the real movement of history. It's a very important section of the German ideology. You know, I've never really understood Althusser. I tried my best to read it. I never really picked up on the young Marx, old Marx. I just see a thinker trying to understand things, and he makes changes all the time in his life. It's not like young Marx and old Marx is enough. Marx is constantly changing, you know, even in the so-called old Marx, as David says in this book, while he's writing Capital 1, he's already writing Capital 3. So David very carefully and cleverly says, when he's talking about rate and mass, he has a question he raises, the answer is in Capital 3, because he's, you know, noting that down over there. Marx is always changing, always thinking, young, old, I'm not sure, but certainly in the German ideology, this is a significant point, that we don't impose our views onto the world. It doesn't work like that. We have to look at the real motion of history. And in a sense, the real movement of history requires us to look at places like China, look at what they are doing, understand what are the experiments. You know, let's understand what's happening in Vietnamese public health. How is it that in Vietnam, they had such a low COVID fatality rate? How is that? Because they have an extraordinarily good public health system, which was praised in 1978 at the Alma Ata meeting of the World Health Organization, and they absorbed traditional Vietnamese medicine into modern medicine in the same way as the Chinese absorbed old Chinese medicine into modern medicine. They didn't neglect it or laugh at it, etc. They were clever, and they built a structure of rural medicine. You see, I'm going to say a few things and then I'll end there. Chris, I know you told me speak as much as you want. It's a dangerous business. But what I want to say is, you know, these countries, as part of the Leninist project, because they understood the worker-peasant alliance, and you can't write about the world today without agriculture. The worker-peasant alliance, they moved towards different forms of land reform in an early way. Now, it's true in Vietnam, North Vietnam in particular, 53 they had land reform. By 56 they were criticizing themselves, you know, very severely. I'm not interested in the criticism. What I'm interested in is what they don't talk about. When you go after landlordism, you create the possibility in a rural area to create collective structures of social welfare. See, this is something you don't think about if you don't understand rural areas. When landlords have a grip on rural society, they don't permit collective structures of social welfare to be built because they create patron-client relations. I know this fundamentally from looking at caste structures in India. Landlords don't want caste to be attacked because caste for them is a mechanism of social control, and they want to be the ones who provide social goods when there's a catastrophe. When you get rid of the landlords, as they did in Vietnam after 53, you can create collective structures of social welfare, and that's what you see in Vietnam today. I have traveled in rural Vietnam, and you get to see there this incredible sense of rural social welfare institutions that provide health and education and retirement schemes. David makes a really good point about how pensions are being stolen in the West. It's not happening in those countries because pension structures are rooted in these collective structures in rural areas. Got to look at those as well. The whole world is not identical to the West. That's something I want you to think about. Agrarian parts of the world are fighting deep struggles to defeat landlordism. That's got to be the center of our focus. Most people in the world today are still living most people in the world in Asia are still living in rural areas. That fight is the key fight. So, I made 3 points, David. I hope those were pretty clear in my own way, rambling, non-theoretical, non-Althusserian, non-properly scholaristic way. But these are things I said from the heart. David Harvey is somebody that I like to think with a lot. This is an important book, and I'm really proud and happy to share this moment, David, to say to people, please read this. It's going to help you. If you've never read David Harvey, this is a really good introduction. Thanks a lot.
I thought it was really important that we sit more with the questions of imperialism, because if we don't, then the questions of capital, it's complete, you're going to go down. It was Stalin who said something along the lines, of like, theory, theory without practice goes nowhere, and practice without theory gropes in the dark. We have to understand, the way that these different concepts are interconnected. And if we don't, centralize imperialism, then especially China, I feel like it's just going to be a dead-ended circle trying to understand how they're acting. Because everything about China is in response to, the collapse of the USSR is in response to American imperialism. I mean, I wouldn't go that far at the USSR, but again, American imperialism, I think, is just a really essential question. I wanted to sit with it. Sorry.
Let me just come in with that, if that's okay. For me, imperialism is not a set of rhetorics. It's understanding a structure, a real structure in the world. I've actually never understood imperialism to prevent industrialization. It's about control of, let me put it another way. Just before he died, I talked to Samir Amin, who was a dear friend of mine and a great teacher and a person who understood things in his own way. And we had many disagreements, not the least of which about Egypt, with which he had his own views. But he's Egyptian. And nowadays in the United States, people say, let's hear from an Egyptian, as if that's somehow more credible, this idea, like I get this sometimes. People say, we want to hear from a Syrian. Which one? Who? Like what class background and so on. But there is this sort of populism that has taken over people's imagination. I can introduce you to lots of terrible Palestinians, that are willing to collude and cooperate with the Israeli apartheid Zionist project and with US imperialism. Lots of Indians, including Narendra Modi, grotesque, and so on. Let's hear from an Indian. Let's bring Narendra Modi to speak to you. Yes, so I'm actually not interested in the idea of imperialism as a set of rhetorics, obviously. These are serious issues of structure. And yes, of course, capitalism will, seek out places where industrialization can take place and so on. But there are certain aspects of control. And this was the conversation with Samir. He said there are 5 or 6 areas of control which are, where there's no permission to export these things. One of them is science and technology. And I mean, David makes a lot about the refusal to allow capital intensive to go to certain places. Another one is financial systems. Control over financial systems is maintained. Control over arms and who gets to be the top dog militarily, maintained. These so-called freedom of navigation exercises. Control over communications, the information war. Just look at the internet. It'll say, this is a Chinese government website. When are you going to say this is funded by the US government? 90% of NGOs funded by the US government. You'll never get that on YouTube or Google or anything. Funded by the Russian government. This is information war. It's to delegitimize these sources of information. Now, I'm not saying they're all great, but that's not the point I'm making. The point is who gets to define things, How do you define what's happening to Venezuela? How do you define what's happening to Cuba? January 11th, okay, something happens in the morning. Miguel Diaz-Canel, president of Cuba, gets into a car in Havana, drives to San Agustin de los Baños, walks among the people and says, what's your... Have you ever seen a US president get into a car and go and talk to protesters? Every day, 3 people are killed in the United States by the police. Where is SOS USA? Never. But yes, there's SOS Cuba. This is an information war, guys. This is control over information. Imperialism isn't a set of rhetorics. It's about the fact that there are these capillaries of control over certain aspects. Finance is a huge element in this. The SWIFT system, the ability to access capital through the IMF. I'll give you a little story. The head of the IMF, a very decent person, Georgieva, she made a statement saying during the pandemic we're going to release capital to countries that are struggling, that need to help their healthcare systems and so on. On the IMF website, it said that the representative from the government of Venezuela in the IMF, and it named a person who is a government official of the government of Nicolas Maduro. So the IMF got a request from the government of Venezuela for funding. For their own money, by the way, just to let you know, a share of their own money. The IMF refused the money. So I called the IMF and I said, what about this? You've got on your own website the name of an official and you're saying that the actual government of Venezuela is in contest only by the United States, Britain, and a half a dozen, formerly colonial countries or imperialist countries, whatever. A day later, this government official's name disappeared from the website. They disappeared the name. Now talk about Stalinism and airbrushing. They just removed the person from the website. This is what I called the person again, and they told me, and I'm speaking to you on the record, they told me that the US Treasury Department is not happy with the US Treasury. What do they have to do with the IMF? You see, so it's control over financial systems. This is imperialism. Give me a better term to explain this. I'm not wedded to the rhetorics of, I'm not interested in standing at a square and yelling and screaming and fulminating and protecting my bourgeoisie. I would like my bourgeoisie to drown in its own spit. I don't care about that. That's not the theory. The theory has to manifestly understand these capillaries of control. You can use any other word. If you want to give me a postmodern word, I'll take it into consideration, but you don't have a better word for it. Give me a better theory. and I'll absorb it. And I'll tell you, this give me a better theory business comes from a Tony Kushner play. You know, Tony Kushner wrote a terrific play called Angels in America. I don't know if you've seen the second part called Perestroika, where Ante-Diluvievich comes to the stage. He's the oldest living Bolshevik. You remember this? Ante-Diluvievich comes and he says, you NEP men, he's yelling at the Gorbachev people, you NEP men, you little snakes. He said, even a snake, he said, before it gives up its skin, grows another one. He said, I want a theory, give me a theory. You've rejected our theory. Even a snake, before it gives up its skin, grows a new. What is your theory? You don't have a theory. You are just going to wither in the sunlight. So if you give me a better theory than the theory of imperialism, I'll adopt it. But you don't have one. And what I find interesting in David's book is all the elements of the theory are there. For instance, the suffocation of certain parts of the world, and they are, in fact, certain parts of the world that are not permitted to move to capital intensive. Bangladesh, for instance. Why cannot Bangladesh move? And David, you make a lot of Bangladesh. Why can't Bangladesh move from labor intensive production in the garment sector to capital intensive? Is it a demographic problem? I don't think so. Yes, it's the domestic bourgeoisie in Bangladesh is ridiculously horrible. We would like to overthrow them. But is that the only problem? Are there other problems? Is there a lack of capital? How will they access capital to make the move to capital intensive and so on? See, Xinjiang, for instance, much in the news for other reasons, is basically capital intensive agriculture. David, one of the interesting features of this is I would like to send a subpoena to John Deere Corporation in Illinois. Because John Deere has exported more farm equipment to Xinjiang province than any other company. Why are they silent when all this stuff is going on about slave labor in Xinjiang? Why doesn't John Deere come on the record and say, yes, but by the way, we also exported all these tractors and combine harvesters? How do you have this massive export of combine harvesters and slave labor in the same, Yes, because you have a fanatical, anti-Semitic Christian evangelic by the name of Adrian Zench, who came on Democracy Now! To talk about lies. Okay, that's what you have. That's control over information and communication systems. And that, you need a theory to explain that. And for me, that theory is imperialism. So just taking up from your views and so on, I agree with you. We need a theory. Give me a better theory, I'll adopt it. Until I get a better theory, this one is pretty good to me. What do we do? Well, 30 years ago, I joined the Communist Party of India Marxist. 30 years ago. Imagine this. The Soviet Union was collapsing and I joined the Communist Party. That's how intelligent I am. I wouldn't have changed anything because I believe, my friend, you have to do things. There's no blueprint that comes at you. There's no theory that comes at you. There's no leadership that's in front of you that is clairvoyant. Lenin in one of his texts says that if you're not willing to make mistakes, you'll do nothing. If you're not willing to make mistakes, you'll do nothing. You have to do things. You have to get involved in things. You have to try to euthanize the landlords. You have to do something. You have to get involved with other people. The point of struggle is to be involved with other people, not to have the correct ideas. You see, it's very easy to develop the correct ideas. We have in this country at least a civilization of grad students who each have the correct idea. But if you don't join together and build movements where you build it in compassion with each other, where you understand that you're not perfect, you're trying to build perfection. And not even perfection, you're trying to, what's that word, asymptotically attain perfection. Like a railway line, which looks like an infinity, it joins. As you keep walking, it keeps looking as if it's not joined. That's the nature of contradictions. You think you want utopia to emerge. If you don't want utopia, you wouldn't do shit. We are motivated by the desire for utopia. You got to do something. You got to get involved. You can't just say, what can I do? You just got to go and do. And then in doing, you'll experience things and you'll grow and you'll learn how to deal with other people. The most important thing in politics, by the way, isn't having like the correct program. It's learning to be not an asshole, you know. Learning to like be in your cell meeting and learning with other people and figuring out how to talk to each other and just being a decent person as you try to model decency in the world. You know, we're trying to model decency and honesty. That's what we're really trying to model. If Marxists are actually honest with each other, that's really what we're going for when we build movements. We want decency, honesty. We want you to go out in front of people. You know, one of the reasons I love Ho Chi Minh is he keeps talking about that. Don't be bureaucratic. Don't be commandist. Don't tell people what to do. I'm not telling you anything to do. I'm just telling you, you got to experience the world. You can't experience the world in the pages of a book alone. There is no revolutionary theory without revolutionary practice. But by the way, that's a vice versa statement. There's no practice without the theory either. And by the way, Lenin didn't finish the sentence. And that quotation comes from What Is to Be Done, which is a book about organization. So yes, thanks for that. What he's saying is, there is no theory which is not then moved into organization which produces practice. It's not just theory and practice. There's not just two concepts there. There's organization. It's a core. The whole book is about organization, and yet people take that sentence out of the book and say, well, it's about theory and practice. That's because they don't want to build organizations. You can't build power unless you build organizations. We don't just want to have the right ideas. We want to build power. We want to win. I'm not struggling, by the way, for the sake of struggling. I want to win. I want to win. I want to abolish capitalism. I want to go beyond this system that treats people as inhumane. You know, as inhumans, as like animals. We want to transcend this system. We don't want this. And to do that, you have to risk yourself in the world. So you can't just say, you know, what can you do? Do something for God's sake. Next month, the International People's Assembly will be launched. If you want to know more about it, there's Manolo de los Santos standing behind the bar. He will tell you everything you want to know about the International People's Assembly. An international organization or network or platform of 200 political organizations from around the world, including the Workers' Party of Tunisia, Communist Party of Nepal, a whole range of groups. We have been building this for over 5 years. Why? Because we need international linkages. We need to build something. And you know what? Here's the other thing. We are willing to allow ourselves to fail. Because if you're not prepared to fail, you'll do nothing. That's the lesson I take from Lenin. We're building this. It's coming. You've got to get involved somehow. You've got to get involved somehow. In September, 26 research organizations from around the world are going to release a document at the United Nations. That document is going to be called A New International Economic Order. It's a nod to the 1974 New International Economic Order General Assembly resolution. 26 research institutes from South Africa, from Lebanon, from Italy, from Cuba, from Venezuela, from Argentina, from India, from China. 26 of us have come together to release this document. Look at this document. It's a post-capitalist vision. Because we don't believe in that nonsensical idea that you can't envision the world after capitalism. We believe you have to try. Because if you don't try, you won't do anything. If you're not willing to fail, friends, you will not risk anything. Don't worry if you fail. It's okay. We're human beings. When we don't have the God perspective, it's okay to fail. Don't beat each other up so viciously, you know, because you somehow sit at God's perspective. You're there to judge the Vietnamese, to judge the Chinese. Of course, give criticisms, but not the way people do, you know, attacking Cuba, saying it's state capitalist, it's this. I'm fed up with that kind of assessment of the world. Be in solidarity with people as they're trying to build something. If you don't do anything and are unwilling to fail, don't be so hard on people who are trying to do something. So, the converse of that, do something, friend. I'm speaking directly to you now. Find your friends and comrades, join them, build something. Build something, it will increase your self-respect. It will also, by the way, because you'll fight better, it will also, by the way, help you understand the chapter David has written on freedom. Because this chapter is about time. We have to fight to get people the time to build the world. The struggle isn't just about wealth, it's about time. People want the time, not just for leisure. They want to love their families. They want to be with their communities. They want to be political people. We need time. Our fight against capitalism is a fight to recover time. They have stolen time from us. They have stolen our neurological systems. They've made us stressed. We don't want that shit. We want to live as people. We want to actually inaugurate history.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, David, Michael, Vijay. So books are for sale over there, and I believe food and drink is still available. Is that right? Yes?
We're waving yes.
Yes. And thank you so much for being here. It's great to see everyone.